Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, over the course of the 2024 election, the Trump campaign spent a lot of their time talking about the premise of expanding the map. The idea is that if you spend your time in a Democrat leaning swing state, such as Minnesota, Virginia, New Mexico, New Hampshire, and the like, and you force Democrats to spend time and effort defending such a state, you'll draw their attention away from the swing states and both demoralize Democrats for if they see you spending all your time in safe Democrat states, the ones that any Democrat would need to win easily to win the presidency, they'll be less likely to think that the Democratic presidential candidate has a chance, especially coupled with all the media storm about Biden being a horrible nominee, losing by however much in the popular vote, losing all these swing states by however much in the aggregates. It really demoralized Democrats to an extent that we probably won't fully see in any election ever again. Even though I do believe that most elections will take on a Republican tilt, I still do think that you won't see the same set in stone Republican landslide that many people expected it to be in July of 2024. In fact, the Trump campaign wasn't at that point debating whether they would be the favorites for the presidential election or not. They were not debating campaign strategy on how they could beat Joe Biden. They were debating on how early in the night the election would be called for them. And had you seen a objective mainstream media, you probably would have seen a similar thing for 2024 after Joe Biden dropped out. It was the most obvious idea ever that Kamala Harris was not going to be a good candidate. And had the media not been completely bought out by Democrats and running laps for them, and obviously, they would have done the same thing for Biden had they not been able to force him out. But had the media been objective in any way whatsoever, that was what the 2024 race should have been about. Kamala Harris never had a chance to win the thing. She was never going to win. The results only confirm that. This is not a margin of victory you make up when everything she did hurt her in the polls and when people getting to know her only made her less likable. But we really didn't get to discuss that over 2024. It would have been a really interesting general election campaign, seeing a modern day electoral landslide, seeing how high can Trump go, how much down ballot lag will save Democrats in the House and Senate, or will there be no down ballot lag and will Democrats get eviscerated in both chambers? And we were robbed of that to some extent. As Americans, as Republicans, as political analysts, you really never got to see quite anything like that until November 6th. No one really said that Trump was the heavy favorite, besides for Lester Tellis, and uh, he had Minnesota flipping to Trump. I don't think he's exactly the most reliable source, but I think that that premise of expanding the map is deeply interesting to me because based on what I saw, at least my interpretation of these 2024 results, I believe that not just in the future Republicans will be able to expand the map, but it could be a matter of electoral necessity that they expand the map. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, these are the core seven swing states. And like I talked about in my last video, I believe that Michigan will take on a Republican tilt for a little bit. Um, or for a while, but what the what I mean by a little bit is that I think Wisconsin and Pennsylvania could potentially take on a slight Democrat tilt for that length of time, which would mean for Republicans to win the presidency, they would want to win North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, or one of Arizona and Nevada. Probably Nevada long term, which means this path, which I always thought to be chaotic and cursed and stupid, is probably Republicans' best long or short term path to the presidency. Once Arizona begins to shift a little bit away from them, Nevada shifted more Republican, and Arizona was much more based on suburbanites being angry at the Biden administration than Nevada, which was almost exclusively service industry workers um, and Hispanics, which I think those trends are much more stable than suburbanites, which swing every which way every election. But there comes a problem for Republicans that if Democrats can win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, they have already won the presidency. No questions asked. That's it. You lose. Or if they have a good night and they win North Carolina, Even if Republicans can hold Georgia, they've already won the presidency. Arizona and Nevada, Democrats have won the presidency. And especially Georgia worries people because Georgia seemingly is gone for Republicans long term. And I rebelled against this a little bit. I won't do it quite in this video. I think I'll do another video exclusively for Georgia and North Carolina. But I will say, before I make that video, my general thesis is kind of the opposite of like a Wisconsin, where I think Georgia won't trend more Republican, but will hold for Republicans around an R+1, R+2 win for a while. And that's like R+1 more than the popular vote. Not every election will be R+1, because Republicans win the popular vote by 8. You're not going to have Georgia stay R+1. But I still do think the GOP will hold there for a little bit, which makes this electoral coalition viable in the long or in the short term. But eventually, you'll lose Georgia, and then what happens? Well, obviously, the immediate solution is win Pennsylvania, but that only ties you. And win Wisconsin, you win 279. Arizona and Nevada can get you over there, no problem. Even if the Democrats win North Carolina, you're golden. But the problem then is you lose Pennsylvania, you lose Michigan, or you lose Arizona, and you're done. Especially Arizona. This is not a stable electoral coalition, especially since you will see states like North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona gain electoral votes, and states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania lose electoral votes. So potentially in the future, this electoral coalition might not even get Republicans to 269, which would be a Republican win in the House of Representatives with House delegations. Complicated process. I've explained in an old video. I could link that. I think I'll link that in the description in case you're interested. But what I think Republicans could potentially expand into long term, we have the obvious solutions like New Jersey. There's been quite a bit of talk about New Mexico. Both of these shifted quite Republican in 2024, especially New Jersey, and give the GOP a lot of hope long term. You've even seen some talk about New York. I know there's still some chatter floating around about Virginia potentially becoming competitive long term, and Republicans potentially being able to win there. Even though they're small, New Hampshire and Maine could potentially also serve as good areas for Republicans, especially New Hampshire. If the GOP continues to improve with Catholics, New Hampshire will go from what was expected to be a Democrat leaning state to potentially even a Republican leaning state. But a state I feel goes under the radar, goes under discussed in these conversations is Minnesota. Now, why? Well, even I myself have spouted this for a little bit. In a lot of my prediction videos, I repeated the line that Minneapolis is a monolith, Hennepin County is a monolith, you will never crack it, and as long as you don't crack it, you will not win Minnesota. And I really believe this. I try not to lie in my videos. I try not to simplify things. That's part of the reason why they're so long. I think that I can give my full thoughts on something and people will agree with me. I believe that the points I make in these videos I can defend quite easily. But at the same time, I'm also human and I do make mistakes. And more importantly, I begin to question the things I say because this idea that Minnesota was gone for the GOP long term, I've looked at it again. And it especially originated with what I talked about last video, which is this rural area test where you skim through the rural areas and see, are they over 70% for the GOP? What shades are they in this map in New York Times? Which is a very simple way of looking at it. You'd probably be better to look at even precinct wide trends, uh, look at even a map with more than 70%, maybe 80%. Look at historical trends, look at the demographic makeup of these counties. But a very simple test that applies to most states is that if the rural areas of a state are relatively unpolarized, like something like Lincoln County, 62 to 37, there's factors that will make it so that, you know, it's probably not going to be able to turn like the panhandle of Texas, where like these counties are 96 to 4 in favor of the GOP. Like, I'm never going to say, well, once the GOP gets 90% of the vote in these rural areas, then they're going to win. I would never say that. But the simple fact is, an area that's trending right, if you have 37% of the county that are potential flips to your party, it's much easier to have an improvement, even a drastic improvement there, than if only 4% of the county is susceptible to flipping to you. And these aren't one election cycle. Like, I do get the fact that, like, the idea, oh yes, just shift Trempealeau County, 20 points Republican in the next 4 years, or like Grant County, just shift that 22 points Republican next 4 years. That's ludicrous. I would never say that's how the GOP wins a state. But the idea is that over time, and when we're talking about a state like Minnesota, we're talking about the need for the GOP to win while losing Georgia and North Carolina. When we're talking about a future where maybe Pennsylvania's in their column, but maybe Wisconsin isn't, iffy, and then maybe Arizona has flipped against them, and maybe another state that we're not fully knowledgeable about the trends of, like maybe Kansas or even Utah or Alaska. When we're talking about that, we're in the near future. We're not 100 years down the line, because at 100 years, politics will be completely irrecognizable from now. 1924, an election where Republicans won every state outside of the Deep South, the former Confederacy. Now, the former Confederacy, well, 10 out of 11 states in the former Confederacy are Republican. The other one is barely Democrat. And then 12 out of 13 of the former Confederate states, including New Mexico and Arizona Territory for that, are now Republican, or 11 out of 13. New Mexico and Virginia are barely Democrat. Politics change a lot then. If I had to gauge, I'd say about 20 years down the line, you will see these rural areas solidify, like 4% each cycle. 20 years, that's 20%. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Would be ludicrous for 4 years. Isn't that ludicrous for 2 or 3 decades? By 2044, an area like um, Clare County, or what's a good example? So Ilkso, I'm not gonna try to pronounce that right. County, Michigan. That's not gonna be 65-34. Um, it shifted Republican this cycle. Actually, probably a better example is some of these other counties. Lake County. We'll switch to Lake County. Um, Lake County. It shifted how many points? 6 points Republican this cycle. Like, over time is going to solidify more, and eventually you're going to see more of these darker red shades begin to populate the rural areas of the state. Now, the reason I'm even talking about Minnesota, and the reason I've reevaluated my own takes on Minnesota, is look at these rural areas. Which way do you think they lean on that rough estimate of a test? You see a lot of areas that Trump is hitting 65% and 66% and 69, 63, 70, 70, 68, 61, 63. He's netting quite a bit of votes from each of these counties. They're not particularly competitive. Even Amy Klobuchar lost the vast majority of these counties when she won by, what, 10 points, more, even more than 10 points more than Kamala Harris did. And she's a massive institution in the state and a massive overperformer. Even she got swept out of most of these counties that she won in 2018, that she won in 2012, that she won in 2006. And I think she also ran in 2000, though don't quote me on that. Like, you've seen these areas become more Republican over time. But the thesis of this video is that they haven't become Republican enough. There is still room for Republicans to grow in these Minnesota rural areas. And you saw that in 2024. And take this with a grain of salt. Like, yes, Minnesota only shifted what, 3 points Republican. The trend to the left of the national environment. I've especially said out of states that Trump really didn't contest, you can kind of uh, kind of interpret a national trend there against other states Trump didn't contest to some extent, but there was a little bit of contesting on Trump's part in Minnesota early on, and for the most part, Minnesota was left out to dry by the entirety of the Trump campaign. While Kamala Harris, I mean, she picked Tim Walz as a running mate. She obviously was slightly worried about Minnesota from the get go, and that's why she picked Tim Walz, and that probably helped her out quite a bit in Minnesota because Tim Walz is relatively popular. He's not the most popular. He doesn't have too much crossover support, but he does have enough crossover support, especially in the suburbs, that he could potentially knock down some of the shifts that would have happened here if Kamala Harris had picked Josh Shapiro or Andy Bashir or Roy Cooper as her running mate instead. That's probably why you didn't see areas like Hennepin County swing at least 2 points, right? Like, if you think that Dearborn, Michigan had a massive Palestinian problem, that's the only reason Trump lost Michigan. Hennepin County has a massive amount of Muslims. Like, Biden, Michigan, it created such a storm when Uncommitted got like 12, 13% of the primary and hit 15% the threshold to receive delegates in three congressional districts. Minnesota hit 18% statewide. It didn't get as many votes because, one, people weren't as focused in on it. It wasn't a standalone primary, it was on Super Tuesday, so people were less focused on that. And by then, the trend of Democrats crossing over to vote for Nikki Haley was much stronger. But it didn't get as many votes, also because Minnesota is a smaller state than Michigan. Wow, who could have known? But still, that's a much bigger amount that voted for uncommitted. Remember, a presidential candidate, Dean Phillips, this was his home state, and he got less than uncommitted, even in his home district, his congressional district that he gave up to run for president. He got less than uncommitted. Uncommitted was a massive factor in Minnesota, and realistically, had you not seen Democrats improve in the suburbs slightly in the Minneapolis metropolitan area, which is trends to some extent, but also was Tim Walz being on the ballot, you would have seen a big Democrat drop off in Hennepin County. You kind of saw this in Ramsey County. Ramsey County, much less suburban, also to some extent has the Palestinian population problem for Democrats. Not completely. I'm not insinuating that like Ramsey County is only Muslims. Hennepin County definitely has more, but it doesn't contain those suburbs, and you saw it shift much more Republican than Hennepin County. You saw the rural areas also shift Republican, but some of these suburban areas, like on the outskirts of here, especially Anoka, being a big one, like they shifted slightly Republican, but they really need to shift that Republican. Washington County, big suburb, 0.3%. Dakota, 1.1%. Scott, 1.8%. Carver, negligible. Wright, negligible. Sherburne, 2.2%. Like, had Tim Walz not been on the ticket, you probably would have seen the state be closer. Not really, because Trump would have improved in the rural areas. Though I do think, like the Iron Range counties over here, like Lake County, St. Louis County, Cook County, Carlton, he might have done better. And in the south of the state, Tim Walz's former congressional district, he might have done a little bit better. Like the fact he didn't improve at all over 2020 in Olmsted County probably was Tim Walz being a factor there. And he probably would have done much better in the south of the state had Tim Walz not been on the ticket. But I think Tim Walz mostly handicapped Trump's margins in the suburbs. And Minnesota's a weird state where Republicans over time have really done not constant, but consistently good in the state because you've seen it be kind of a melting pot for the different coalitions. Back when Bush was president, it was closer than a state like Michigan, not closer than Wisconsin because Wisconsin's another state kind of like that. But why it was close was Bush got fucking crushed in the rural areas. He wasn't getting these Trump margins in the rural areas, but he was able to run it up quite a bit in these suburban counties. You even see this with Reagan's near loss of the state in 1984, and even stuff like Norm Coleman winning the Senate election in 2002. And what was his name? Forget the gubernatorial candidate's name, winning the governor election in 2006. But Republicans used to do much better in these suburban areas, and especially Hennepin County. Like, Democrats were not hitting 70% in Hennepin County. It was more like 60%, maybe 62%. That was the average Democrat margin in Hennepin County. That was enough to win statewide because Republicans were running it up in the suburban counties, but nowhere else. But it wasn't exactly an impressive margin. You saw kind of a crossroads at 2016 where Trump was able to some extent hold the GOP coalition in these suburban counties. He was able to do relatively well in Hennepin County, especially the third parties contributed to this. I do think the third parties took away from Hillary Clinton. Had they not been on the ballot, you probably would have seen a result similar to this, like 4 point Democrat win um, for Hillary Clinton, which that's interesting. Um, had third parties not been on the ballot, it would have been more like 2024. Had Tim Walz not been on the ballot, this would have been more like 2016. Am I trying to establish a pattern here? I don't know. But you saw kind of a crossroads with that coalition where Trump did his magic in the rural areas, improved a lot there, but he was also able to relatively strongly hold the GOP coalition in these suburban counties. 2020, you saw the undoing of this, even with the BLM riots in Minneapolis, which probably should have moved to the Minneapolis metropolitan area Republican. It was expected to move Republican, if I'm not mistaken. That really was the only part of the state that shifted Democrat, and they shifted Democrat by quite a bit. Part of this was third parties going home to Joe Biden. You even saw this on the concurrent Senate election. You had a Senate incumbent who was elected in 2018 in a special election, underperformed Biden against a relatively strong Republican nominee, but not someone who should have overperformed the top ticket by two. Because third parties in that race took a lot from Democrats, especially in Hennepin County, and this makes sense because Democrats really go in a Hennepin County or bus strategy in Minnesota, kind of similar to Michigan, except Hennepin County and the surrounding area is a larger portion of the state than Michigan, and Hennepin County is much more Democrat than Wayne County is. But you see those third parties take away from Democrats in Hennepin County. In 2020, they came home. This election was kind of the first decent Republican performance in Minnesota with low third parties. I mean, there were third parties on the ballot, obviously, but like in total, they barely summed to 2%. Um, that's not really impressive for a state that usually votes much more third party than the nation at large. There's a fly buzzing around my desktop. And you have to wonder what happens when 2024, an election with historically low third party performances, you have to wonder what happens when you distance yourself from that. When eventually, in 2020, I think no matter the candidates, no matter the circumstances, third parties are going to do a little bit better. It's ironic, 2024, we went in thinking, oh my God, third parties are going to get 20% of the vote. People are so upset with the duopoly of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That was mostly manufactured by the media. And retarded. Uh, People who like Trump like Trump. People who hated Biden more hated Biden more. They were not going to vote for a third party. I don't think RFK would have gotten the 20% people were expecting and won like five fucking counties in Maine and New Hampshire, like people were predicting. But to some extent, there's really no place but up for the third parties to go. Like 2% in Minnesota is pathetic. And either third parties just don't become a factor in American elections or they go up. And where does that take from Democrats? In Hennepin County. And even if that doesn't happen, what you'll see over time is Republicans will probably do better in the urban areas of most states, but that will help in places like Hennepin and Ramsey. When Democrats depend solely on those margins, it'll begin to slowly whittle away for Democrats. Now, the problem with Minnesota is Hennepin County is not exclusively urban areas. An area like Wayne County, to some extent, is mostly urban areas. There's some suburbs, of course, but Hennepin County is, for the most part, pretty suburban, and those suburbs are extremely Democrat, which makes it so that me predicting like a 6 point shift right out of Hennepin County is a bit unrealistic, and that's really the thorn in Minnesota Republican side. Those suburbs will continue to move Democrat. But two things. One, the third parties will take away from Democrats in Hennepin County long term. And two, they'll reach a ceiling. Eventually, Democrats will reach a ceiling in Hennepin County because by that same logic that I put up for these rural areas, and also for Democrats, it's much harder to push your margin in such a big, diverse county to 80%. Like, it'd be easier for Trump to get 80% in a county like Kennebec. Um, Kennebec even shifted 4.4% Republican in 2024, just because it's more homogeneous, it's more exclusively rural. Just Republicans will most of the time be able to push the margin higher in a county like Kennebec because Democrats do better in very racially diverse, very urban to suburban counties, and it's harder to push the margin higher there. It's also why Democrats usually do better in counties with more population, which once again makes it harder to get like 80% of there. And I think at some point, Minnesota Democrats will be close to maxed here, and you'll get some votes out of these suburban areas like Dakota County, nowhere near to maxed. Washington County, are not maxed. They might flip Anoka eventually, might flip Carver eventually, Scott maybe, Rice County probably eventually. And I think that's where Minnesota becomes a swing state because you'll see Republicans push the margin much higher in these rural areas. Democrats kind of freeze out in Hennepin County and these surrounding areas and try to pick it up in these suburban counties. And that's where Minnesota becomes a toss-up. That's why I think Minnesota will become a toss-up. Because I think Republicans long term have quite a bit of ground to gain in these rural areas, and Democrats don't have as many places to gain. And especially if Tim Walz weren't on the ballot, the state would have been probably closer. I mean, I'm not sure if it'd be closer than New Hampshire, which was like a less than 3 point win. But if it were like a 2 to 3 point win, Closer than Nevada, closer than Arizona, which kind of already happened. Not Nevada, but very close. Closer than Georgia, closer than North Carolina, even potentially closer than Pennsylvania, which would have been insane. There's a serious shot Republicans have long term of picking off Minnesota. No one's talking about it. And this isn't 4 years down the line because, like I said, most of this will be fueled by Republicans slowly encroaching on the Democratic margin in Minnesota. And we also have to wait and see on these suburban counties. Potentially, they could swing Democrat. And if they swing Democrat, I'd expect it to be fairly fast. You saw in 2020 them swing pretty heavily Democrat fairly fast and then just kind of freeze. Like even 2022, like it's not like the Atlanta suburban trends where you saw that continue into 2022 in those in the Senate race and even in stuff like the gubernatorial race. I mean, the suburbs just kind of stopped this cycle. They just gave up on it. But it's a long term trend for Republicans, and I don't think it happens tomorrow. But if you see a Rust Belt map, something like this, even though it will lose population, that puts the burden on Democrats to make it up elsewhere. Because at that point, as a Democrat, your best strategy probably is going to win Nebraska's first, win Alaska. Um, at that point, I'm not sure. Um, I mean, depending on how Mormons vote in the future, maybe Utah or Kansas. But even so, you're all right at the margin of error there. And Republicans win a state like North Carolina or Arizona, which this map would be completely retarded. But, and I guess Colorado and New Mexico being islands, uh, Democratic islands in the middle of Republican states is also kind of retarded. But if you see the map look something like this, or even this, it's still a Republican win, which is why I think I really can't say Minnesota will drift off into being a Republican state because the data really isn't there, and that pretty much preserves the Republican hegemony over the presidency forever. Which, when I say Republicans are probably slightly favored to win most presidential elections, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying Republicans will win every presidential election by 10%. They'll win every swing state. It'll be a 361 map, like Fuhrer on point politics has promised us. Like that. That's not this is not my prediction for this is not the median prediction for the every presidential election in the future. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm implying whatsoever. But I think that you'll see new swing states open up, um, and especially in the future when I mean it's kind of the common consensus. But I do think eventually Georgia will begin to trend away from Republicans. Uh, like at some point, you will see Georgia flip Democrat, and at that point, the GOP their margin of error starts to go down. Something like North Carolina flipping, and then like lose Pennsylvania. That's it. Reverse of the Trump coalition. But if you can expand the map into something like Minnesota, you got hope long term. And this is what I think. Kind of another part of my video talking about how presidential elections probably tilt Republican for the foreseeable future was about. I think to some extent the map balances itself. Like the Electoral College will provide paths for both candidates to win. Like, kind of like I was saying at the beginning of this video, I really don't think there'll be an election in the near future where people like there's zero chance that the underdog wins. And I mean, to some extent, that's what we said in 2016. And look how that worked out. Even 2020, and look how that worked out. Closest election in American history since 2 decades prior, when Bush won by the narrowest margin in American history. Besides for I guess I don't know 2 decades before that, but there really isn't going to be an election where it's guaranteed one side wins. And even if, yeah, it's easier. Um, you see an electoral map that looks something like this. There's a much easier path for Republicans to win than for Democrats. Even if you expand it into like the expanded swing states, something like this, Republicans started 219, and I really don't see any state under that being competitive for any time soon. Like the closest after that was Maine's second congressional district, which was already well, it says R plus 10, but it was R plus 9.6. But it's going to be really hard for Democrats to find a state any of these, out of these 48 states on three congressional districts that they can win long term. Or not long term, like between short and long term. they're really only going to be able to flip any of them long term. And because of that, as the electoral map opens up, it's really the burden's on Democrats to solidify states into their column. Like, at some point, to preserve the electoral college being the way it is, uh, toss up between the two parties. Like, Democrats have to do something like completely revert the trends in New Jersey and New Mexico, New Hampshire, bring it fully into their column because that's four electoral votes you don't want to have to worry about, especially when Republicans, for the near time being, if I'm wrong about Michigan, will have these states probably in their column for a little bit, which means that they have to break one state, so that the rest of the country into their column, which New Hampshire qualifies as. But even if you can lock down New Hampshire and Minnesota, best case scenario, you're playing for a seven electoral vote advantage, which we saw how that worked out for Kamala Harris, and that's virtually negligible. If the GOP can flip Nevada to their side fully, the electoral map's a dead heat. And that's the problem for Democrats as states like Minnesota open up. The electoral map will not become a dead heat. Democrats probably won't, for the short term at least, be able to expand into any of the states um, no, not California, that I have marked as red in this map. And that screws them over. But that's probably why I would say Minnesota is important. It opens up a lot more GOP possibilities to win 270 electoral votes. It makes it much easier for a candidate to just sweep the Rust Belt and not worry about anything else. Well, now you really have to find a balance between the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt. It's like way back before the election when back when we just theorized about electoral maps. When something like this was considered a potential GOP path to victory because you win New Mexico, okay, or like Chris Sununu running. Oh, Chris Sununu could win New Hampshire. Woohoo! Yay! Breaking past that Sun Belt, and you kind of see a similar thing happening for the Rust Belt. The GOP winning these three Rust Belt states long term, you'll have to break past the Rust Belt. So it's either win a state like Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, or win Minnesota, which kind of proves it so that in redistricting for the near future, they probably shouldn't have too much trouble with reapportionment. I mean, you have to go down five electoral votes actually, because 269 would yield to Republicans. You have to go down five electoral votes based on this when you have states like Texas, Florida growing in population to lose this electoral college map. And that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But, anyways, I'm not sure. None of this is concrete. This is mostly just me theorizing out loud. It's nice to have the platform to talk about these things because it's interesting talking about these future electoral map coalitions, especially since these are the type of things that we would have never been able to dream about 4 years ago in this position. It's interesting. Potentially, I don't know how long this channel is up for. I don't know if it dies between now and 2028, but if you're from 2028, Jesus Christ, that's 3.5 years away. Uh, Congrats for making it back this far. It's hard to scroll back 4 years in YouTube video history, but if you are from 2028, I'm sure this makes no sense. And that's what I put this out knowing. Like, I know out of maybe 100 of these takes I have, five of them are going to be right. But if I get those five right, like, that's insane to be able to look at one election, basically, because the way that the coalitions have evolved, you really can't look at midterms, you really can't look at off years, you can't even look at 2020. Be able to base everything off one election and still grasp a hair, an aspect of an election 4 years away is insane, seeing how much the country has changed, how much these coalitions have changed over the last 4 years. So, anyways, that being said, thank you for watching. I'm trying to slowly cut down the time of my videos. I mean, this was one fucking state, and it went on for 30 minutes. I talk a while. This is a monologue format if you've ever been in a lecture hall. I mean, I hope my videos are more fun than a lecture. I hope they're more engaging. I know they're not, but I talk a lot. Mea culpa. But, anyways, thank you for watching. You made it through a lot. Subscribe if you're new, if you enjoyed this video. Comment down below any thoughts. You're an idiot. Minnesota will go save Democrat. I mean, there's a chance if the rural areas just don't budge, and then the suburban areas shoot Democrat off a cliff. I'm going to be wrong. Whoa! What a What a possibility. I was the guy who said that Wisconsin was a lock for Trump half the election cycle. It wasn't. Had I channeled that same energy into Pennsylvania, I would have been. I could have been like slightly right. It was the guy who thought for a while that Trump's most likely path to 270 electoral votes was Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And then eventually at the end of the election, I decided it was Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which was interesting. Um, because had I switched out Wisconsin for Nevada, I would have been somewhat right. You take Georgia out of the equation, that was Trump's path. But I'm completely used to being wrong. So we'll see what happens. Thank you for watching. Godspeed. Tester's done. Out.